Welcome, deep divers. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a question that might feel, I don't know, a bit unexpected, maybe even a little uncomfortable for some folks.
Hmm.
But it really gets to the heart of questions about identity, experience, and how society is structured. We're asking, what are the challenges of being white?
It's a really interesting prompt, isn't it? And our mission today is basically to explore this fascinating bunch of sources that a listener sent over.
Yeah.
These materials really shine a light on different facets of this very question. And our goal is just to meticulously pull out the key insights, maybe some surprising facts, and try to offer a genuinely nuanced look at whiteness, both biologically and societally.
Right.
And, we'll be staying completely impartial, objective, just laying out what the research, the discussions, the historical accounts actually say.
Exactly. And it's such a varied mix of sources we've got here. I mean, they range from pretty detailed scientific analyses, academic papers looking at genetics, anthropology, all the way to like candid personal online discussions from forums, Reddit, that kind of thing.
Yeah, the real raw stuff sometimes.
Totally. Plus, comprehensive historical accounts looking at how race itself was, well, constructed, and even modern viral content from YouTube and TikTok that grapple with these ideas.
So it's a real mix.
It really
Yeah.
is. It promises a, comprehensive, multi-layered approach to a topic that might seem simple on the surface, but as you quickly find out, it's anything but it.
Indeed. It's really a deep dive designed to maybe uncover some of the unseen, the unexamined aspects, and just encourage all of us, including you listening, to look beyond the obvious. #I. The biological and physical realities of whiteness.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this. Maybe starting with something that feels a bit more tangible, though as we'll see, it still has its own subtleties.
Yeah.
The biological and physical realities often associated with what we broadly call whiteness.
Exactly. And I think the most obvious place to start is skin and eye pigmentation. It's the most visible aspect, right?
Sure.
So one of the clearest biological points that comes up in the sources regarding lighter skin tones is a significantly higher susceptibility to sunburn.
Okay.
The research is pretty clear. Lighter skin has less melanin. That's the natural pigment, responsible for skin, hair, eye color.
Mm-hmm.
And having less melanin just means you have less natural protection against the sun's UV radiation. Simple as that, really.
So your body tries to defend itself by tanning, producing more melanin.
Yeah, it mounts a defense, sure. Tanning is that response. But the baseline protection, the starting point, is just markedly lower.
So it's like having a weaker built-in shield against something that's always out there. And building on that, the materials also talk about faster skin aging in lighter skin. Is that directly linked? The lower melanin, the UV protection?
That's a direct correlation, yeah. Less melanin equals less natural UV shielding,
Okay.
which over time leads to more pronounced and accelerated signs of aging
Yeah.
because of that chronic sun exposure. We're talking fine lines, wrinkles, sunspots, loss of elasticity. It means that, diligent, lifelong sun protection isn't just a suggestion. It's actually a crucial, often kind of unseen daily burden for people with lighter skin.
A constant vigilance almost.
In a way, yeah. And this vulnerability, it isn't just the skin. It extends to the eyes, too.
Yeah.
People with lighter eye colors, blue, green, hazel, they generally have less melanin in their irises.
Right.
And that lack of pigment basically means their eyes are inherently more sensitive to bright light. So you get discomfort, maybe even pain, in really sunny conditions.
Compared to darker eyes where there's more melanin acting like a filter.
Exactly. It's like a natural internal filter reducing glare.
Yeah.
So the challenge for lighter-eyed people is this constant need for external protection, sunglasses, hats, things others might not even think about twice.
It really seems like melanin is the key player here, shaping so many of these biological realities. But let's dig a bit deeper into the genetics. The sources talk about dominant and recessive alleles. How does that actually work for skin and eye color, especially when lighter skin is often, maybe too simply called just a recessive gene?
Yeah, that's an area that gets oversimplified a lot, and our sources help unpack the real complexity.
Good.
So the genetic basis, as it's explained, involves alleles linked to darker skin pigmentation, generally tending to be dominant, while those for lighter skin are often recessive.
Okay. Tending, often, so not absolute.
Precisely. And it's really vital to stress this isn't some simple black versus white gene situation.
Yeah.
Human skin and hair color is what scientists call a polygenic trait.
Polygenic, meaning many genes.
Exactly. Not just one or two, but many different genes, sometimes hundreds, all interacting together to determine the final amount and type of melanin produced and how it gets distributed.
Wow, okay.
So instead of a single light switch, think of it more like a huge orchestra. Countless genetic instruments playing different parts, each one subtly influencing the overall melanin production.
A vast genetic symphony, lots of dials, not just on-off, that really clarifies it.
Yeah, I think it does. So the result we see is white skin or very light pigmentation. It's basically what happens when those dominant make lots of melanin instructions aren't strongly present from either parent across a whole range of these specific gene functions. It's the cumulative effect of many recessive alleles, essentially a genetic blueprint that just doesn't push hard for high melanin production.
Okay.
Darker tones, on the flip side, are the additive combined effect of multiple dominant gene versions that really promote melanin synthesis strongly.
So this polygenic view really dismantles those old, rigid ideas of biological races, doesn't it?
Fundamentally, it reveals this huge continuous spectrum of human genetic diversity, even within populations we might broadly label as white. The challenge for understanding, really, is letting go of those simplistic binary notions of race that biology just doesn't back up. ##B, hair characteristics and broader factors affecting hair loss.
Okay, so a really complex interplay of genes for skin and eyes, much more than simple dominant recessive. What about hair? Our sources mention hair characteristics too, and how they might relate to perceived racial groups.
Yeah, hair texture is another one of those observable biological traits often linked with ancestry, though again, much more complex than usually assumed.
Right.
The material describes hair typically associated with European or Middle Eastern ancestry as often having an oval cross-section.
An oval shape, okay.
And that oval shape contributes significantly to wavy or straight hair types. This is contrasted, for example, with the rounder cross-sections that often produce very straight hair, or the flatter, kind of ribbon-like cross-sections that lead to tightly coiled hair common in other ancestries.
So structural differences, but still part of a wide spectrum.
Exactly. It's all variation.
And when we talk about hair, especially within, say, European ancestry lines, the conversation often turns to thinning and hair loss. Is there a specific link suggested in the sources between that oval cross-section or naturally straighter, maybe finer hair and hair loss?
Well, the sources clarify something important here. While hair thinning and loss are incredibly common as people age across all demographics,
Right, it happens to lots of people.
attributing it mainly or solely to naturally straight and thin hair, like some popular ideas might suggest, is really an oversimplification,
Okay, so it's not the main driver.
not according to the research presented.
Yeah.
It emphasizes that a much wider range of factors play more significant determining roles. Things like the strong influence of genetics, male or female pattern baldness running in families,
Yeah.
hormonal changes, especially with aging or certain medical conditions, underlying health issues, even lifestyle stuff like diet and stress,
So a whole host of things.
a whole host. So while certain hair types might have specific traits like an oval shape or finer strands, the big factors determining who experiences hair loss and when are far more complex and, frankly, universal.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge here, perhaps, is the often unspoken expectation or even pressure around hair fullness and vitality and the psychological hit when it's lost. And that's something that really cuts across any simple racial lines.
Mm-hmm.
##C. Comparative physical and performance observations, as presented in sources.
That makes sense. Looking at the broader, more universal factors. Now, beyond these specific physical traits like skin, eyes, hair, our sources also include some comparative observations, looking at broader groups, presenting them as findings within the material itself.
Yes, that's right.
For instance, the sources mention observations about educational attainment, comparing white demographics to Asian demographics.
Yes, the collected material does point to observations like that. Noting comparative differences when looking at Asian demographics in specific contexts, often within Western societies, it highlights patterns of, say, high academic achievement or concentration in certain specialized fields.
Okay. And on a different track, but similarly comparative, the sources also reference observations about athletic performance compared to African demographics.
That's also correct.
Yeah.
The sources refer to observed patterns regarding athletic performance, maybe in particular sports or physical activities, when comparing to African demographics.
Okay.
And it is absolutely crucial for us to reiterate, here we are simply relaying the information as presented in the source material provided to us.
Right. No judgment, no endorsement.
Exactly. We're not adding any external interpretation. Our job is just to distill what the sources themselves contain, so you, the listener, understand the scope of what was submitted.
Got it.
The challenge, obviously, for anyone looking at these kinds of observations is to see them perhaps as statistical trends within very specific contexts, and absolutely not as some kind of inherent biological destiny for individuals.
Right. Avoiding oversimplification.
And resisting any urge to draw conclusions about inherent superiority or inferiority based on group averages. That's just not sound. #2. Whiteness as an evolving social construct and global identity.
Okay, so we've looked at some biological aspects, which, as you've really laid out, are way more nuanced than any rigid categories suggest. In fact, they kind of challenge the whole idea of biological race.
They really do.
So if biology doesn't neatly define whiteness, how did it become such a powerful and often, like you said, unexamined category in our societies? That takes us from the physical to the really profound social realities. Whiteness is an evolving social construct and a global identity. #A. Deconstructing race as a biological reality.
This is where things get really fundamental for understanding identity. The comprehensive research in our stack really hammers this home. The overwhelming scientific consensus today is that race, as we commonly think of it, is primarily a social construct.
A social idea, not a fixed biological fact.
Exactly. Not a fixed biological category. And a huge piece of evidence for this came from the Human Genome Project, which famously showed that there's often more genetic variation within the groups we call races than there is between them.
More difference inside the group than between groups.
Precisely. Which is kind of mind-blowing when you first hear it.
It really is.
It fundamentally highlights how incredibly genetically similar all humans are across the globe.
Yeah.
It makes these rigid, separate biological race categories pretty much scientifically indefensible. It's a real challenge to perceptions that are often deeply ingrained.
Yeah, it totally pulls the rug out from under that old idea of separate human races as distinct biological types. And this idea of race being socially constructed, it's not just some modern scientific finding, is it? We can actually see how racial categories have shifted and changed throughout history and in different places.
Oh, absolutely. The fluidity of these categories is one of the strongest arguments for their constructed nature. Our sources give some great examples.
Right.
Well, they contrast Brazil's system, which historically was much more based on appearance, much more fluid. They recognized tons of racial categories, sometimes dozens, letting people navigate identity based on subtle differences in how they looked.
Okay, very different from the U.S.
Massively different from the historical rigidity of the U.S. one-drop rule, where legally and socially, anyone with any known black ancestry was classified as black, period, regardless of their appearance, even if they looked white.
And that wasn't just social custom, it was law.
It was a powerful legal tool, often used explicitly to expand the pool of people who could be enslaved, and later to maintain strict segregation and racial purity laws. It starkly denied people access to the privileges of whiteness, even if they visually appeared white. It was clearly about social control, not biology.
Wow.
But, a really significant societal shift started to happen in the U.S. when the Census Bureau began allowing people to identify with multiple racial categories, starting in 2000.
Right, that was a big change.
Huge. It reflected this growing recognition of mixed identities. And there's a compelling stat. By 2010, a clear majority, 53% of children with one white and one black parent, were identified by their parents as belonging to both races.
So a real move away from that old rigid binary.
Definitely signals a societal shift towards recognizing and validating mixed identities, pushing us further from those outdated definitions. The challenge for society and for individuals is really embracing this fluidity instead of clinging to old, unscientific boxes. #B the West. The historical construction of whiteness and its legacy.
So, okay, racial categories aren't fixed biological facts. They're social ideas, constructs that have changed dramatically. That leads us right to the question, how did whiteness itself get constructed? How did it become this concept with so much power? The sources really detail its modern origins, showing it emerging strongly in European thinking during those intense times of global exploration, the rise of colonialism, and that intellectual explosion of the scientific revolution, roughly 16th to 18th centuries.
Exactly, and it's absolutely critical to grasp that the early classifications by influential figures like Carl Linnaeus, who first formally put humans into subspecies,
Right, I remember reading about him.
and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who came up with that five-race system, including Caucasian,
Yeah.
these weren't just neutral academic observations.
Okay, what were they then?
Well, the historical accounts show pretty clearly they were explicitly used to create hierarchies, often putting white Europeans or Caucasians right at the top of humanity, and then arranging other groups below them, frequently assigning increasingly negative or undesirable traits the further down the hierarchy you went.
So ranking people based on race.
Precisely. This emergent scientific racism, which we have to stress, is totally debunked now by modern genetics and anthropology.
Right, like we just discussed with the Genome Project.
Exactly. Modern science reveals way more genetic diversity within these supposed racial groups than between them, dismantling the whole idea of distinct biological races. But back then, this so-called science served a very specific and pretty sinister purpose:
Which what?
to rationalize and solidify power structures that put white Europeans on top. It was a powerful ideological weapon used to justify colonialism, land theft, the horrific system of African slavery, and the subjugation of indigenous peoples worldwide.
Wow, so it was built to justify inequality.
Absolutely. This deeply problematic foundation, this scientific excuse for inequality, became, as the sources say, baked into the systems of society. It laid down this legacy that still impacts us profoundly today, presenting a huge challenge to overcome and dismantle.
That's a really heavy legacy based on oppression, not truth. And the sources also point out something interesting, how historically whiteness often just functioned as the default category. It was kind of invisible to those who had it.
That's such a critical insight. Because in stark contrast, blackness, for example, became this category that was intensely policed, constantly defined, scrutinized, delineated, often with severe legal consequences, as we saw with the one-drop rule.
Right.
The white identity, however, was often just treated as the norm, the unspoken baseline against which every other identity was measured and defined.
So it wasn't really seen as a race itself, just normal.
Exactly. And this allowed it to largely escape critical examination as a racial category. This invisibility, this default status, meant that the advantages and privileges that came along with being seen as white became normalized, often completely unrecognized by the very people benefiting from them. The challenge here, then, for anyone categorized as white, is to recognize this historical invisibility and understand how it obscured this systemic nature of race and its impacts, making it much harder to perceive the unearned advantages that came with it. #C, the statistical reality of whiteness as a global minority.
That historical context is just so vital for understanding the modern day. And speaking of modern implications, let's look at a statistical reality that often surprises people and really pushes back against that historical idea of whiteness as the norm, the fact that globally whiteness represents a minority.
Yes, the sources emphatically state this statistical reality. Individuals identified as white make up a global minority. The estimates put it at around 11% of the world's population.
Only 11% globally. Wow.
Yeah, it's a striking figure, especially if your perspective is shaped mainly by Western countries where white populations have historically been, or still are, the majority. And the projections indicate this percentage is likely to continue declining.
Okay, but it's really important to clarify what global minority means here, right?
Absolutely crucial. In this context, global minority is purely a statistical description. It's about population numbers, plain and simple. It does not automatically mean social status or marginalization on a global scale.
Right. A group can be small in number worldwide, but still hold significant power in certain places.
Precisely. Economic power, political power, cultural influence. These can be concentrated even within a numerically smaller global group, depending on historical and national contexts.
So it's about population size, not necessarily power dynamics or disadvantage. But how does this statistical fact, being a global minority, relate to that historical function of whiteness as the sort of human norm or default?
Well, it inherently challenges that notion, doesn't it? It pushes back against any implicit idea that whiteness is the standard human template.
Yeah, it provides a different frame.
It provides a global demographic context that directly counters that perception. It forces a rethinking of what normal means on a planetary scale. However, and this is incredibly important, and our sources highlight it impartially,
Okay.
it's crucial to see how this simple statistical fact gets dangerously twisted and misinterpreted by certain harmful ideologies, especially in some online fringe spaces.
You mean things like?
Terms like white genocide or the Great Replacement theory. These narratives seize on demographic shifts, but they are completely unfounded racist conspiracy theories.
Right, they're not based in reality.
Not at all. They manipulate population statistics to promote white supremacy and deliberately incite fear, fundamentally misrepresenting normal demographic changes and inventing malicious intent where absolutely none exists.
So the challenge for listeners.
The challenge for anyone listening and wanting to be informed is to clearly differentiate between factual demographic trends which are real and the way those trends are weaponized by these dangerous ideologies. Understanding that the statistical reality of being a global minority is completely distinct from these baseless, fear-mongering narratives is vital. #330. Navigating complex conversations and the invisible nature of whiteness.
That's a really critical distinction to make, separating the fact from the hateful fiction. Okay, let's shift gears a bit now and dig into some of the more maybe emotional, psychological, and social challenges connected to whiteness, especially when it comes to talking about race today. #NS. Emotional and psychological challenges in racial discussions.
Yeah, this is a really important area. Discussions about race and racism, especially in societies like the U.S. or others with complex histories of racial hierarchy, can be genuinely, profoundly, emotionally challenging for white people. Our sources talk about this, often leading to what gets called racial stress or discomfort. And this isn't about pointing fingers at individuals, but more about recognizing the inherent tension that arises when these deeply embedded, often invisible systems of power and privilege are brought out into the open.
It creates unease.
A real sense of unease for many, yeah.
And this discomfort, it can show up in different ways, right? Often defensive ways. The research mentions a few reactions.
Yes, insights from social psychology and critical race studies that appear in our materials detail how some white individuals might react quite defensively when race comes up.
Like how?
Well, it could manifest as obvious anger or frustration, maybe a palpable fear, sometimes even guilt. Or it might look like withdrawing, engaging in argumentative denial, shutting down, or just going completely silent.
Okay.
And the sources suggest this often comes from feeling personally attacked, challenged, accused, or blamed for historical wrongs or current systemic problems.
Even if the discussion is about the system, not them personally?
Exactly. Even when it's about structures, not individual blame, it can feel like a direct hit to one's moral character or their personal story of fairness and hard work. The real challenge here is finding ways to move past that initial defensiveness towards genuine understanding.
So it's not just an intellectual disagreement. There's this strong, sometimes overwhelming emotional layer that can just shut down any productive conversation. And really grappling with concepts like white privilege or systemic racism, that can be a tough journey in itself.
It absolutely can be. The sources really elaborate on this. The process of truly coming to terms with the existence and the pervasive impact of white privilege and systemic racism can be profoundly disorienting, difficult.
I can see that.
It often requires a fundamental rethinking of your entire worldview assumptions you've maybe held your whole life about meritocracy, about personal achievement, about how fair society inherently is.
Right, challenging core beliefs.
Exactly. This cognitive dissonance trying to square your personal narrative of, I worked hard for everything I have, with the uncomfortable truth of unearned societal advantages that can be a huge psychological hurdle. It forces people to deconstruct deeply held beliefs and face uncomfortable realities about history and the present day. And furthermore, the material touches on this idea that sometimes a struggle to empathize with people whose experiences seem vastly different from your own, that might contribute to a kind of knee-jerk suspicion or skepticism towards certain identity claims, including those around race.
An empathy gap.
Yeah, an empathy gap. And when that's not addressed, it can really perpetuate misunderstandings and make genuine connection incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
#BabeB, the invisible nature and difficulty in recognizing privilege.
That idea of empathy gaps and the difficulty of reevaluating your worldview leads us straight back to another big challenge we touched on, the invisible nature of whiteness itself, and how that invisibility makes recognizing privilege so hard.
Precisely. The research really highlights this. Living in a white-dominant culture often just means white people aren't regularly confronted with their racial identity in the same way people of color are.
It's not constantly brought to their attention.
Right. Their race isn't constantly foregrounded, questioned, made relevant in daily interactions and how systems work, in media portrayals. This lack of direct, constant racialization contributes massively to its invisible quality.
The old fish and water analogy.
Exactly like the fish and water analogy. You don't notice the water because it's all you've ever known until maybe you're outside of it.
So if you're not always being reminded of your race or if it's just treated as the standard, the default,
Yeah,
it's inherently much harder to see how it might actually be an unearned advantage for you.
exactly. The normalized default status of whiteness in many societies can make it extraordinarily difficult for white individuals to recognize the systemic, often unearned privileges they benefit from simply by virtue of being in that category.
And these privileges aren't about getting special favors, right?
No, no. It's not usually about individual acts of kindness or malice. It's about the structural advantage that might provide smoother pathways, maybe unquestioned assumptions of competence or belonging, a general freedom from the kind of racialized scrutiny that people of color often experience routinely.
Okay.
And this profound lack of recognition, this difficulty in seeing the water you swim in, that can seriously hinder productive conversations about racial inequality. Because the very existence of that privilege might be denied, dismissed, or just deeply misunderstood. It's a real challenge to see something that has always just been there for you.
Which brings us back to something you mentioned earlier about whiteness needing to be seen as a specific category, not just the invisible default.
Yes.
The sources seem to stress that a crucial and often challenging step towards meaningfully addressing racial inequality is for white people to actually acknowledge whiteness as a distinct racial category itself, rather than just the universal invisible standard. It means understanding its specific historical leverage, as the sources put it, in creating and maintaining certain social structures and power imbalances.
Seeing it as a defined identity with a history.
Yeah, seeing it as a specific identity with its own specific history and impact, not just the generic human experience. Hashtag tag 5. Experiences of individual discrimination and intersectional challenges. That shift in perspective from invisible default to defined category sounds really significant. Now, we've mostly talked about systemic issues, structural advantages, but it's also important to acknowledge that individuals within any large group can face challenges too. Our sources do touch on experiences of individual discrimination and also the complexities when identities intersect. Hashtag tag hashtag A. Individual acts of prejudice, less prevalent systemically.
Yes, it's important to present the full picture here. The research does acknowledge that some white individuals do report experiencing individual acts of discrimination or prejudice.
Okay.
Now, we're not talking about systemic disadvantage here, but more like isolated incidents of bias or unkindness.
Like what kind of things?
Could be things like hearing derogatory slurs, maybe insensitive comments about their specific ethnic background, maybe experiences tied to being Italian-American, Irish-American, Polish-American, other European ethnicities that might have faced prejudice historically as they were assimilating into the broader category of American whiteness.
Right. Groups that weren't always considered fully white.
Exactly. However, and the sources are really meticulous and clear on these individual acts, while definitely hurtful, absolutely unwarranted, they're generally far less prevalent systemically compared to the pervasive, often daily, and institutionally reinforced experiences of racism and discrimination faced by people of color.
Okay, that's the key distinction.
It's the crucial distinction. Individual bias versus systemic oppression. One is often isolated, maybe interpersonal. The other is deeply woven into the very fabric of society, into institutions, policies, norms.
Yeah. So individual acts of prejudice can happen, sure, but it's not the same as that widespread, baked-in systemic disadvantage other groups contend with. And the sources also mention that even within the broad white category, some subgroups might experience these individual acts more often than others.
That's another important nuance. Yeah.
Yeah.
The material points out that white individuals from particular ethnic backgrounds, especially maybe those whose ancestors faced discrimination when they immigrated, or maybe those who currently belong to lower socioeconomic classes, they might report higher rates of these individual acts of prejudice compared to other white groups who are maybe more established or affluent.
So white isn't one single experience.
Not at all. It shows that white isn't monolithic. It's a broad category covering a whole spectrum of histories and current realities. The challenge here is understanding that while, yes, individual prejudice can happen to anyone, it doesn't equate to the systemic and historical oppression faced by racialized minority groups. Recognizing that difference is just vital for having productive talks about equity.
And then when we add other layers of identity, like sexual orientation or gender identity, the picture gets even more complex, doesn't it? The sources specifically mention white LGBTQ+ individuals and how intersectionality creates unique challenges for them.
Absolutely. That's a key point about intersectionality. It shows how Different aspects of your identity can combine, sometimes compounding experiences of marginalization.
So for white LGBTQ plus folks,
Well, according to the data presented, white LGBTQ plus individuals experience significantly higher levels of discrimination compared to straight, cisgender white individuals.
okay, significantly higher.
Yes, which underscores that while their whiteness might grant them certain privileges within a white-dominant society,
Right.
their sexual orientation or gender identity introduces new and substantial avenues for discrimination. They might face bias in finding jobs, housing, getting healthcare, or just in everyday social interactions,
Yeah.
specifically because they're LGBTQ+.
So we're navigating both sides of it.
Exactly. They're navigating the world with both the relative advantages linked to their racial identity and the distinct disadvantages linked to their sexual or gender identity. The challenge for these individuals is managing this complex duality where one part of who they are might offer privilege, while another part simultaneously subjects them to prejudice and discrimination. It leads to unique kinds of stress and vulnerability, #V transracialism, as a lens for identity fluidity and societal reaction.
Okay, we've been talking a lot about how race is largely a social construct, how it evolves, how identity itself can be fluid. This leads us naturally into a really cutting edge and often very controversial topic that comes up in our sources, transracialism.
Yes.
It serves as this fascinating, though sometimes pretty incendiary lens for looking at identity fluidity and the really complex ways society reacts when people claim identities outside the usual boxes. #A. The analogy to transgender identity and societal resistance.
Indeed. And one of the most common arguments you see presented in the sources, often by proponents of transracial identity, draws a direct analogy to transgender identity.
Right, making a comparison.
Yeah, the thinking goes. As society shows increasing acceptance, though, it's far from universal of transgender identity, where someone's internal gender doesn't match the sex assigned at birth. Well, some commentators argue that for logical consistency, we should also accept transracial identity. The core argument often boils down to, if identity is fundamentally about how you feel inside, your internal sense of self that goes beyond biology, why should that principle apply differently to race versus gender?
It's an argument from similarity, basically.
Exactly.
It sounds almost straightforward when you put it like that, philosophically, but the societal reaction seems, well, anything but straightforward. Our sources describe this really strong, almost visceral, knee-jerk suspicion and major pushback that society often shows against claims of transracial identity.
Oh, definitely.
And that stands in such stark contrast to the growing, even if it's still incomplete, acceptance of transgender identity. It's a really striking difference.
It is. And this huge difference in societal acceptance begs a really important, really complex question. Why? Why the difference?
Yeah.
And the sources dig into this quite deeply. They explain that race is seen as a more closely policed category than gender for profound historical and systemic reasons.
Policed because of its history.
Exactly. This policing comes directly from its incredibly heavy and brutal historical baggage.
Yeah.
Centuries of intergenerational oppression, the horrific legacy of chattel slavery, ongoing civil rights struggles, all of which have defined, enforced, and exploited racial categories in specific violent ways.
Right.
So the very idea of choosing a race, particularly if it's a historically marginalized one, is often seen by many people as profoundly trivializing these deeply rooted, traumatic, and ongoing experiences of systemic oppression and violence.
Making light of real suffering.
That's the perception. It's seen as fundamentally different from gender identity struggles, where the fight for recognition and rights, while incredibly significant and deeply personal, doesn't carry that same specific centuries-long historical weight of legally codified race-based subjugation and violence that has shaped racial categories. The challenge, then, for proponents of transracial identity is somehow bridging this massive gap of historical context and lived experience. #, B&E, authenticity, cultural appropriation, and privilege concerns.
So that immense historical weight of race and its connection to systemic violence creates this very different kind of friction and resistance, which naturally brings up really serious concerns about authenticity, about cultural appropriation, and especially about white privilege when people discuss transracial identity claims. One big concern critics raise is that it can make race seem less just a costume.
That's a really central point of criticism for many. They argue that this kind of identification risks reducing entire cultures often built through unimaginable struggle, resilience, resistance against oppression. Reducing all that into something you can just put on, like an outfit, or adopt as an aesthetic choice. From this viewpoint, it inherently ignores the deep history, the profound pain, the collective identity tied to certain racial groups. It's seen less as an internal reality and more as an external, maybe superficial, or even exploitative choice. The challenge for someone identifying as transracial becomes proving authenticity to a very skeptical public.
And then there's that really potent argument about white privilege, which comes up again and again in these discussions. Our sources explain that when a white person identifies as belonging to a historically oppressed racial group, it's often viewed as a direct exercise of white privilege itself.
The logic behind that argument is quite profound. Critics argue that individuals born with the privileges associated with whiteness could, theoretically at least, choose to step back into their white identity and regain access to all the associated societal advantages and protections if things get difficult.
Something unavailable to people born into that oppression.
Exactly. It's perceived as having the option to opt in and, potentially, opt out of the lived realities and consequences of a particular racial identity, a profound privilege inherently denied to those who are racially marginalized from birth. It highlights this perceived lack of permanent stakes for the transracial individual compared to those born into the identity they're claiming.
These ethical debates and theoretical arguments often explode into public view through very high-profile cases, which our sources point to as key flashpoints. We all remember Rachel Dolezal, right? The white woman who presented as black for years.
Right. That ignited a massive nationwide conversation about authenticity, appropriation, the complexities of racial identity in the 21st century. Huge controversy.
And then there's the case of Ollie London, who underwent extensive surgeries trying to look like a specific K-pop idol.
Yeah, raising significant concerns about potentially fetishizing and appropriating Korean identity and culture. And his later shifts in self-identification, at one point identifying as a trans woman, later embracing conservative views that further muddy the waters, raising questions about consistency, authenticity, and the very nature of self-identification when it involves these deep cultural and racial markers.
And Martina Big, the German model who underwent really extreme medical procedures to drastically darken her skin, change her features.
Her case pushed the boundaries even further, didn't it?
Yeah.
Sparking intense ethical debates about authenticity, the role of physical alteration in identity claims, and really questioning how far self-identification can legitimately stretch, especially when it involves such dramatic, irreversible physical changes.
Yeah.
These high-profile examples consistently highlight the significant public friction, the moral outrage, the deep societal discomfort that transracial claims can generate. They really show the challenges society faces in trying to reconcile individual claims of identity with collective histories and experiences.
But importantly, the sources also acknowledge that the motivations behind transracial identification can be incredibly diverse and complex. It's crucial to understand it might not always be about appropriation or something superficial.
No, absolutely not. The motivations presented can really range widely. On one hand, it might stem from a genuinely deep cultural connection, a profound sense of belonging to a specific culture, an internal feeling that resonates as authentic for that individual, even if it doesn't align with their assigned race at birth.
Okay.
On the other end of the spectrum, motivations could include a desire to escape personal trauma, or maybe negative societal stereotypes associated with one's assigned race. For instance, the sources mention people wanting to distance themselves from what they perceive as negative ideas, sometimes unfairly linked to their birth identity. Things like stereotypes about ghetto culture, poverty, crime, or victim mentality.
This whole range of reasons.
A whole range. This complexity really underscores that it's rarely a simple one-size-fits-all phenomenon, and the challenges faced by individuals making these claims are likely as varied and complex as their motivations. #outro. So as we wrap up this really extensive deep dive, it's just abundantly clear that being white involves navigating this remarkably complex, multifaceted landscape.
Yeah.
On one hand, you've got specific biological traits, like, as we discussed, increased sunburn risk from less melanin, or maybe more eye sensitivity with lighter irises, which are distinct vulnerabilities.
Lots of physical stuff.
But then on the other hand, it involves grappling with whiteness as this profound social construct, something that's dynamically evolved through history, fundamentally shaped power dynamics, and often, as we've seen, functioned as this kind of invisible or unexamined default setting.
We've really seen how race, even though science overwhelmingly tells us it's a social construct, it still has these profound, undeniable, very real-world impacts on people's identities, their individual experiences, and the very structures of society. Understanding the challenges of whiteness, then, requires grappling with its often unseen historical construction,
Yeah.
its evolving perception, including that statistical reality of being a global minority, the nuances between individual prejudice versus systemic discrimination, and these intense societal reactions to identity fluidity, especially around something like transracialism.
It really underscores that identity, in the broadest sense, is just this deeply complex, evolving process. It's not some fixed, static point.
Absolutely.
And this leads us to a really fascinating, maybe even provocative final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Given this increasing fluidity of identity we're seeing play out, the ongoing reevaluation of racial categories in academia and public life, and these rapid technological advancements, especially things like genome editing, that could theoretically, physically alter traits we currently link to race.
Wow, yeah.
How might our understanding of whiteness and racial identity more broadly continue to evolve in the future? What completely new questions might pop up about belonging, about authenticity, about societal structures, in a world where those lines between biology and self-identification become even blurrier?
That's a huge question.
It's a huge question. No easy answers, for sure, but definitely something that invites some deep thinking as our world keeps changing.
Absolutely. Well, this has been an incredibly rich, insightful, and definitely challenging deep dive into a truly complex subject. We really encourage you to keep exploring these questions, keep seeking out different perspectives, and keep those brains working. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.